The boardroom at Griffin Park smelled of stale coffee and decades of disappointment. Matthew Benham sat alone at the head of the scarred wooden table, laptop open before him, spreadsheets glowing in the dim light. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows of the modest stadium that had been Brentford's home since 1904. It was a Tuesday evening, and the club he'd just purchased was languishing in League One, the third tier of English football, with debts mounting and hope fading. Most people thought he was mad, a wealthy man who'd made his fortune through sports analytics and betting models, now pouring millions into a small West London club that hadn't seen the top flight since 1947. But Benham saw something nobody else could see. He saw data, patterns, inefficiencies in the market, and a pathway to success that defied traditional football wisdom. He'd grown up supporting Brentford, standing on the terraces at Griffin Park as a boy, watching his local club struggle year after year. Those memories never left him. Even as he built Smart Odds, his revolutionary sports analytics company, even as he became one of the most successful sports bettors in the world, Brentford remained in his heart. Now he had the resources to transform that love into something tangible, something revolutionary. The door opened and Rasmus Ankersen walked in, shaking rain from his jacket. The young Danish football analyst had caught Benham's attention with his innovative thinking about talent identification and player development. They'd spent months discussing a radical approach to football management, one that would rely on data rather than gut instinct, statistics rather than reputation. Matthew, the staff are worried. They think we're going to tear everything apart. Benham looked up, his eyes tired but determined behind wire-rimmed glasses. We're going to tear everything apart, Rasmus, but we're going to rebuild it into something better, something sustainable. The fans won't understand at first. They're used to traditional football, big signings, famous managers, the old way of doing things. Then we'll have to show them there's a better way. We're not going to compete by spending money we don't have. We're going to compete by being smarter than everyone else. The strategy was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Brentford would use advanced analytics to identify undervalued players, young talents overlooked by bigger clubs, and develop them into stars before selling them for profit. The money would be reinvested, creating a sustainable cycle. No sugar daddy funding, no reckless spending, just intelligent decision-making backed by data. The first season under the new model was chaotic. Fans protested outside the stadium, confused by unfamiliar signings and the departure of fan favourites. The manager, appointed based on his tactical flexibility and willingness to embrace analytics, struggled to implement the system. Benham sat in his office during matches, listening to the groans and jeers filtering through the walls, wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. After a particularly brutal defeat, he walked through the empty corridors of Griffin Park, stopping in the home dressing room. The smell of liniment and sweat hung in the air. He thought about his childhood, about standing in the cold watching his team lose, about the generations of Brentford fans who'd known nothing but disappointment. Was he just adding to that legacy of failure? His phone buzzed. An email from the analytics team with updated player performance metrics. Despite the results, the underlying numbers were promising. They were creating more chances, controlling possession better. Their expected goals were far higher than their actual goals. The process was working. They just needed time. At a supporters' meeting, Benham faced the anger directly. Hundreds of fans packed into a local hall, their frustration palpable in the thick air. "You're destroying our club," someone shouted from the back. "We don't want your computers and spreadsheets. We want real football." Benham stood at the front, surprisingly calm despite the hostility. He'd run complex algorithms involving millions of pounds. He could handle angry fans. "I understand your frustration. I really do. I've been where you are, standing in the rain at Griffin Park, watching us lose. But I'm asking you to trust me. Not because I'm wealthy, not because I think I'm cleverer than you, but because I love this club as much as you do. We're building something different here, something that will last. Give us time." The room didn't erupt in applause. Most people left still angry, still skeptical. But a few stayed behind, wanting to understand, willing to listen. It was a start. The breakthrough came gradually, then suddenly. Players identified by the analytics team began to flourish. A young striker from Norway, signed for a fraction of what traditional clubs were paying, started scoring consistently. A midfielder from Denmark, overlooked because he didn't fit the English mould, became the creative heartbeat of the team. The system was working. By the end of the season, Brentford had climbed the table. They didn't win promotion, but they'd shown progress. More importantly, the underlying metrics suggested they were building something special. Benham spent long nights refining the model, adjusting algorithms, learning from mistakes. He brought in specialists in sports science, psychology, nutrition. Every aspect of the club became data-driven, optimized, professional. The following season, everything clicked. The team played beautiful, attacking football. Griffin Park became a fortress. Fans who'd protested now sang songs celebrating the revolution. When Brentford secured promotion to the Championship, the second tier of English football, Benham stood among the supporters, tears streaming down his face. Not because of the achievement itself, but because people were starting to believe. The Championship proved to be a different beast entirely. Clubs with parachute payments from the Premier League, massive wage bills, and decades of infrastructure surrounded Brentford. Griffin Park, charming and historic, suddenly felt inadequate. The dressing rooms were cramped, the training facilities basic compared to their rivals. But Benham refused to panic or abandon the principles that had brought them this far. Instead, he doubled down on the data-driven approach, knowing that sustainability would outlast short-term spending. The analytics department expanded. More scouts were hired, not to watch matches in person primarily, but to verify what the data suggested. Every player in Europe's top leagues was tracked, assessed, valued according to metrics that went far beyond goals and assists. Benham personally reviewed reports late into the night, cross-referencing statistics with video footage, searching for those hidden gems that traditional clubs missed. One signing exemplified the approach perfectly. A young winger playing in France's second division had caught the algorithm's attention. His underlying numbers were exceptional. His movement patterns suggested elite potential, but he'd been dismissed by bigger clubs as too raw, too inconsistent. Brentford paid a modest fee, and within 6 months, he was one of the Championship's most exciting players. When a Premier League club came calling, offering 20 times what Brentford had paid, Benham made the hardest decision of his tenure. He called the player into his office at the training ground. The young man sat nervously, unsure why the owner wanted to speak with him directly. "You've been brilliant for us, truly brilliant. And now you have an opportunity to play in the Premier League. We're not going to stand in your way." The player's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "But, sir, we're building something special here. I want to help Brentford get to the Premier League." Benham smiled, touched by the loyalty but understanding the bigger picture. "You will help us. The money from this transfer will allow us to sign 3 players who can continue our journey. That's how we sustain this model. We develop players, we sell them, we reinvest. It's not glamorous, but it works." The transfer went through. Fans were devastated initially, but when Benham used the funds to sign multiple talented players, including a striker from Holland whose statistics suggested he'd score 20 goals, understanding began to dawn. This wasn't a traditional football club anymore. This was something new, something built on logic rather than emotion. The season became a roller coaster. Brentford played breathtaking football at times, dismantling teams with intricate passing and clinical finishing. Other matches saw them struggle, the squad still finding consistency. Benham attended every home match, sitting in the director's box, his face betraying little emotion, even during the most dramatic moments. But inside, his heart raced with every chance, every tackle, every decision. At Wembley, for the Championship playoff final, Benham stood in the tunnel before kick-off, watching his players prepare for the biggest match in the club's modern history. The opponent was a traditional footballing giant, a club with history, resources, and expectation. Brentford were the underdogs, the statistical anomaly, the team that supposedly couldn't compete at this level. The match was agony. Brentford dominated possession, created chances, played the way Benham had envisioned. But football doesn't always respect statistics. The opponents scored from their only real opportunity, a long-range effort that deflected wickedly past the goalkeeper. As the final whistle blew, Benham sat motionless in his seat, surrounded by celebrating opposition fans, feeling the weight of failure crushing down on him. In the dressing room afterwards, the silence was deafening. Players sat with heads in hands, some crying openly. Benham walked in, and everyone looked up at him, expecting reassurance, wisdom, something to ease the pain. "I know this hurts. It should hurt. But everything we've built, everything we've achieved, it's still here. We're going to learn from this. We're going to improve, and we're going to come back stronger. This isn't the end of our story. It's just a chapter." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. Walking out of Wembley, past the celebrating opposition fans, Benham questioned everything. Had he been wrong? Was the data-driven approach fundamentally flawed when it came to the crucial moments? Could algorithms account for pressure, for emotion, for luck? That summer, he nearly walked away. The disappointment had cut deeper than any business failure. But Rasmus Ankerson sat with him in his office, spreadsheets covering every surface. "Matthew, look at these numbers. Look at what we've built. We're not failing. We're competing with clubs that spend 5 times what we spend. The model works. We just need time." Benham studied the data, the evidence that contradicted his emotions. Ankerson was right. By every objective measure, Brentford were outperforming their resources. They'd been unlucky at Wembley, nothing more. The process was sound. "All right, we go again. But we need to be smarter, better, more efficient." The squad was rebuilt with typical precision. More undervalued talents were identified and signed. The coaching staff was strengthened. Sports science protocols were enhanced. Every marginal gain was pursued obsessively. Benham had learned that in football's crucial moments, preparation and process mattered more than hope. The next season, Brentford were relentless. They topped the Championship table for months, playing football that had pundits questioning how such a small club could compete so effectively. The secret, as always, was in the details. Better recovery protocols meant fewer injuries. Tactical analysis identified opponent weaknesses with surgical precision. Player recruitment brought in exactly the right profiles to fit the system. But as the season reached its climax, Brentford faltered. A run of poor results saw them slip out of the automatic promotion places. Once again, they'd be heading to Wembley for the playoffs. Once again, everything would come down to one match. The memories of the previous failure haunted everyone at the club. The week before the playoff final felt like walking through treacle. Every training session was analysed, every player's physical and mental state monitored. Benham brought in sports psychologists to help the squad deal with the trauma of the previous Wembley defeat. The data showed that teams who'd lost playoff finals before were statistically less likely to win when they returned. But Benham refused to accept that pattern would apply to Brentford. They would be the exception. Thomas Frank, the head coach who'd embraced the analytical approach whilst maintaining the human touch players needed, gathered the squad 2 days before the final. His Danish accent carried authority as he addressed the room. "We've been here before. We know what Wembley feels like when you lose. That memory will either destroy us or drive us forward. I know which one I choose. Benham watched from the doorway, impressed by Frank's ability to balance emotion with pragmatism. The coach understood that whilst data informed decisions, humans played the matches. You needed both elements to succeed. On the morning of the final, Benham couldn't eat breakfast. His stomach churned with anxiety, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his early days building smart odds. He'd risked millions on this project, invested years of his life, but more than that, he'd promised a fan base that had suffered for decades that their faith would be rewarded. The weight of that promise felt suffocating. At Wembley, the atmosphere was electric. 40,000 Brentford supporters had made the journey, many of them fans who'd watched the club struggle through the lower leagues for their entire lives. Benham stood in the tunnel alongside the players, something he rarely did, needing to feel the magnitude of the moment. As the teams walked out onto the pristine Wembley pitch, the roar from the Brentford end was thunderous, desperate, full of decades of pent-up hope. The match started cautiously. Both teams understood what was at stake. The opponent, another club with parachute payments and Premier League pedigree, had the experience edge. Brentford had the analytics, the process, the belief. For 30 minutes, the game was locked in tension, neither side willing to take risks. Then, in the 34th minute, everything changed. A corner kick, delivered with precision based on analysis of the opponent's defensive weaknesses, found a Brentford player unmarked at the near post. His header was powerful, accurate, unstoppable. The net bulged, and 40,000 voices exploded in unison. Benham leapt from his seat, a rare display of emotion, before quickly composing himself. One goal meant nothing. They needed to see this through. The opponent pressed forward desperately in the second half, throwing players forward, abandoning their shape. The Brentford analytics team had predicted this reaction, and Frank had prepared accordingly. The team dropped deeper, absorbed pressure, then counter-attacked with devastating pace. In the 78th minute, a lightning-quick break saw Brentford striker race clear. One-on-one with the goalkeeper, the entire stadium held its breath. The finish was clinical, composed, perfect, 2-0. Benham allowed himself to believe. The data suggested that teams leading by 2 goals at this stage won 94% of the time. But football had taught him that statistics couldn't account for everything. The final 12 minutes felt like hours. Every clearance, every tackle, every second that ticked away brought them closer to the impossible dream. When the referee blew the final whistle, pandemonium erupted. Players collapsed to the turf in tears. The coaching staff embraced on the touchline, and Benham, the quiet mathematician who'd revolutionized a football club through spreadsheets and algorithms, buried his face in his hands and wept. Not delicate tears, but great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, releasing years of pressure, doubt, and determination. On the pitch, as the players celebrated with the trophy, Benham was pulled into the chaos by Thomas Frank. The fans were chanting his name, something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He'd never wanted personal glory, just success for the club he loved. But this moment belonged to everyone, to the supporters who'd trusted his vision, to the staff who'd worked tirelessly, to the players who'd believed in a different way. In the dressing room afterwards, champagne sprayed everywhere, songs echoed off the walls, grown men acted like children. Benham sat in the corner, watching it all with a satisfied smile. Rasmus Ankersen squeezed in beside him. "We did it, Matthew, we actually did it. We proved the model works. That's what matters. Now comes the hard part. The Premier League. Staying there. That's going to require everything we've learned and more." The celebration continued long into the night, but Benham's mind was already racing ahead. The Premier League represented a different challenge entirely. Clubs with billion-pound valuations, world-class players, unlimited resources. Could Brentford's sustainable, data-driven model compete at that level? The analytics suggested it was possible, but possible wasn't guaranteed. The summer was frantic. Griffin Park, their home for over a century, was being left behind. The new Brentford Community Stadium was ready, a modern facility that would give them the infrastructure to compete. But sentiment tugged at Benham as he walked through Griffin Park one final time before it closed. This place had housed his childhood dreams, witnessed the beginning of the revolution. Leaving it felt like abandoning a piece of history. The transfer market demanded ruthless decisions. Several players who'd been crucial to promotion didn't fit the Premier League requirements. They were sold, replaced by signings that raised eyebrows. A goalkeeper from Spain playing in the lower divisions, a striker from the French second tier, a defender from Denmark's Superliga. Traditional pundits scoffed at Brentford's recruitment, predicting immediate relegation. Benham read the predictions with grim amusement. They'd heard it all before. Too small, too analytical, not enough Premier League experience, but the data told a different story. Every signing had metrics that suggested they'd perform at a higher level. The model had worked in League One and the Championship. Now it would face its ultimate test. The opening match of Brentford's first Premier League season was against Arsenal, one of England's traditional giants, at the brand new Brentford Community Stadium. The symmetry wasn't lost on Benham. Arsenal, just down the road in North London, represented everything Brentford had never been: wealthy, successful, glamorous. As the teams lined up, with the stadium packed to capacity and television cameras broadcasting to millions worldwide, Benham felt his hands trembling slightly. This was the moment that would define whether his entire project had been folly or genius. What happened next shocked English football. Brentford tore into Arsenal with fearless intensity. The striker from the French second tier, written off as inadequate for this level, scored twice in the opening 20 minutes. The tactics, meticulously planned using opponent analysis, exploited Arsenal's defensive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. When the final whistle confirmed a 2-0 victory, the stadium erupted in scenes of absolute euphoria. Benham remained seated, allowing the magnitude to sink in. They hadn't just survived their first Premier League match, they'd dominated it. The media response was predictable. Fluke, they said. Arsenal were simply poor. Brentford would regress to the mean. But match after match, the predictions proved wrong. The team played with organisation, discipline, and a tactical sophistication that belied their status as newcomers. The data-driven approach to set pieces, in particular, proved devastating. Brentford scored more goals from corners than any other team in the division, not through luck, but through hours of analysis identifying optimal delivery positions and runner timing. By Christmas, Brentford sat comfortably in mid-table, an extraordinary achievement for a promoted club. Benham attended every match, still uncomfortable with the attention, but proud of the vindication. After one particularly impressive victory, a journalist cornered him outside the stadium. "Mr. Benham, people are calling this one of the greatest underdog stories in Premier League history. How does it feel?" He paused, considering the question carefully. "It's not an underdog story. It's a story about doing things differently, about trusting process over panic. We're not defying expectations through magic or luck. We're simply being more efficient than clubs with 10 times our resources." The journalist scribbled notes, but Benham knew his words wouldn't fit the narrative people wanted. They preferred fairy tales to spreadsheets, romance to rationality, but he didn't need people to understand. He just needed the model to work. The inevitable challenges arrived. Key players suffered injuries. Opponents adapted to Brentford's tactics. A difficult run of fixtures saw points become scarce. Benham spent sleepless nights reviewing data, searching for solutions. The analytics suggested they were still performing well in underlying metrics, but results weren't following. This was the test he'd feared, the moment when faith in process would be challenged by harsh reality. a meeting with Thomas Frank became crucial. The coach sat across from Benham in his office, both men exhausted from the relentless pressure of Premier League football. The players are scared, Matthew. They're starting to doubt whether we belong at this level. What do the numbers say? The numbers say we're fine, but football is played by humans, not algorithms. They need belief, not statistics. Benham leaned back, acknowledging the truth in Frank's words. He'd spent years perfecting the analytical approach, but he'd also learned that humans needed emotional sustenance alongside tactical instruction. Then give them belief. Remind them what we've already achieved. We're not just surviving in the Premier League, Thomas, we're competing. That's extraordinary. The conversation marked a subtle shift. Benham realized that his greatest strength, the ability to remain emotionally detached and trust data, could also be a weakness. Football required passion alongside process. The two weren't contradictory, they were complementary. The season concluded with Brentford finishing 13th, a remarkable achievement that exceeded even optimistic projections. More importantly, they'd done it whilst maintaining financial sustainability, developing young players, and proving that a different approach could succeed at the highest level. Other clubs began studying Brentford's methods, trying to replicate the model. In the summer, Benham made another difficult decision. Their star striker, the one who'd scored on the opening day, received an enormous offer from a Champions League club. The temptation to keep him, to build around him, was powerful. But that wasn't the model. Sustainability required constant evolution, buying low and selling high, reinvesting intelligently. "We're letting him go," Benham told Frank during a meeting. "The fans will be devastated. The fans understand now. They've seen it work. They trust us." The transfer went through, and true to Benham's prediction, whilst there was disappointment, there was also acceptance. Brentford used the funds to sign 3 players whose profiles suggested they'd provide equal or greater value. The cycle continued. Years later, with Brentford established as a fixture in the Premier League, Benham sat in his office overlooking the training ground. The walls displayed charts and graphs, evidence of the revolution he'd created. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. A young analyst entered, nervous but excited. "Sir, I've been running projections for the next 5 seasons. If we maintain current efficiency levels, the model suggests we could challenge for European qualification." Benham studied the data, a small smile crossing his face. When he'd bought this club, languishing in League One, such a statement would have seemed insane. Now it was simply another target, another challenge to be analysed and pursued. Then let's see if we can prove the data right again. The story of Matthew Benham and Brentford wasn't about overnight success or magical transformation. It was about vision, patience, and the courage to do things differently despite mockery and doubt. It proved that in football, as in life, sustainable success came not from following the crowd, but from trusting your principles even when the path seemed impossible. Against all odds, they'd succeeded, and they were just getting started. If you enjoy our content, like, comment, and share, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.